In my previous video, I read Deuteronomy 28, which is to explain the black chaos. But I want to further break down what it means to be a Deuteronomy 28 people. And to be a Deuteronomy 28 people is merely to be a covenanted people. Let's discuss this matter further in this dialogue. While Deuteronomy 28 is comprehensive within itself, it doesn't tell the total story of why God chose his people. And really even the who, what, where, when, and why of being chosen. I'm sure there are more scriptures for that, but I want to focus right now on Deuteronomy chapter 7. Because that is more thorough and comprehensive as to why God chose his people, the concept of enemies, meaning nations that are against his people, as well as how God repays judgment. This is actually a more who, what, where, when, and why of being chosen, and it helps make sense of chosen outside of this concept of it being a privilege, rather being a duty. So if you're going to be chosen, it's a responsibility. It's something that carries much weight. And the serious nature of it means serious judgment attached. So we're going to dive into the intricacies of chosenness and tie that into Deuteronomy 28. Let's dive into the concept of enemies, as well as the difference between the chosen and the non-chosen. So I'll start with enemies. Israel has many enemies, and this is obvious when you look in the Old Testament. There were many wars between Israel and opposing nations. You ever wonder why those wars were? What was the point of Israel always being in battle? I believe it's because the nations wanted what Israel had, and they wanted to be in the position that Israel was in. But this isn't to say that their hatred of Israel is just due to what you have. Because even if you don't have it, they will hate you. As the Bible says, they have a perpetual hatred against God's people. So that explains certain levels of discrimination. But I should note that perpetual hatred precedes our judgment, and it doesn't stop after our judgment. And it isn't because of our judgment. If you look into Deuteronomy 28, where it lists the blessings of Israel, Israel still would have enemies, even in their perfect era, but they would just have God's protection in order to deal with those enemies greater than they currently have now. Part of the benefit of being chosen is protection from those who hate you, and part of us disobeying God was we lost those benefits, so we weren't going to get the protection of those who hate us. Instead, we would actually be oppressed by them and put under them from God himself. And being chosen is not about how intelligent, beautiful, etc. vanities you possess over other nations. It's simply about God. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 7 and look at verse 1, it talks about the 7 nations mightier than Israel. And I'm presuming there are many more that are mightier than Israel. But in reference to that specific verse, it talks about how those nations are stronger and they would oppose Israel and fight wars with Israel. And so I'm presuming that Israel is not the strongest people, is not the most intelligent, is not the most competent, because that point was even reiterated in Deuteronomy 7, verses 7, where it states, "The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all people." When he says you were the fewest of all people, it has nothing to do with population data, because God iterates in other parts of the scriptures how many of his people exist, and that there were very many of his people throughout history. So being chosen is not about anything you could do. It's really about who God is and why he chose you in the first place, which let's get into. Why did God choose his people? Deuteronomy 7, verse 8. "Because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn upon your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen from the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt." Verse 9. "Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him, and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." Just looking at verses 8 and 9, we know, number 1, because he loved his people. Number 2, because he wants to keep the oath which he made with our forefathers. Number 3, because he is God. Number 4, the faithful God. Number 5, who keeps covenant and has mercy. It has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with how mighty you are. It has nothing to do with how great you are, because if it did, then your judgment wouldn't even happen because it would be based on you. But because it's based on him, then your judgment's going to also be based on him. Your blessings are going to also be based on him. Being chosen is based on him and him alone. Being chosen is not about what someone's title is. Like, oh, I'm chosen, therefore it means something about that person. No, it means something about that person's God. To be chosen and knowing that they are chosen by their God is the context that you should never forget, or else it's going to become a Pharisee mentality where you're arrogant and you think it's all about you. Now, why is being chosen a difficult task? Never frame being chosen as some kind of privilege or honor, because there is so much represented in what we're supposed to do, not to earn our place, not to gain God's favor, because you can't. Your good works are as filthy rags to God. This is not for good work's sake that we are chosen, therefore you can't maintain being chosen per se on that scale. But it is a covenant, so there are rules, there are regulations, there are standards, there are boundaries, convictions, values, ways of life that comes with attaining covenant. And also covenant is tied to bloodline, so even on a marital level, there are structural ways that we have to fulfill covenant. Because being chosen is the identity, the covenant is the mold, it is the framework, it is the documentation behind that identity. In order to be a chosen person, you have to fulfill the qualities that make up being chosen. You can't just, oh, well, I'm chosen, I exist, that's it. There is a portion of this that goes with God's order. Verse 10, and repayeth them that hate him to their face, to destroy them. He will not be slack to him that hateth him, he will repay him to his face. Verse 11, thou shalt therefore keep the commandments, and the statutes, and the judgments, which I command thee this day, to do them. Verse 12, wherefore it shall come to pass, if ye hearken to these judgments, and keep and do them, that the Lord thy God shall keep unto thee the covenant and the mercy which he sware unto thy fathers. Being chosen is hearkening to his judgments, keeping them and doing them, keeping the commandments, keeping the statutes, keeping all that God would tell us to fulfill. Because if we don't, that is what God considers hate. The Bible says, if you love me, you will obey my commands. If you hate him, which is what it says in verse 10, he will destroy you to your face. He's not slack in doing that. Our people hated God by not abiding according to the things he commanded us to fulfill, and therefore he repaid us to our face. The entirety of Deuteronomy 7 goes in depth between following God's order and dealing with enemies of Israel. He reiterates some of the portions of Deuteronomy 28 in, if you are to fulfill the order, you will be blessed. And there are some new portions that Deuteronomy 7 goes into that Deuteronomy 28 doesn't, which is how God could drive out other nations which harm his people had we obeyed him. Now that we have explained Deuteronomy 7 and its role in being chosen, we will explain, on a summary basis, Deuteronomy 28. Number 1, there are two functions of this book: what you can gain for being righteous versus what you can lose due to your unrighteousness. Number 2, if you as a people retain the qualities of the covenant, such as obedience, order, and regulation, blessings will be given unto you. But if you as a people fail to adhere to covenant, then judgment will be given unto you. Number 3. Although you cannot earn your bloodline's placement as the chosen, to ensure that God is enacting his righteousness and does not bless you with unearned privileges, our portion of maintaining the covenant is required. God is not in the business of giving people unearned privileges, which is why God says he is not mocked and that we reap what we sow. The concept of reaping and sowing applies directly to the covenant of God. Number 4. Let us illustrate the difference between the first portion of Deuteronomy 28 and the second. The first portion of Deuteronomy 28 represents the ideals of status, wealth, fame, access to material resources, vast opportunities, respect from outside nations not being able to harm you, God's protection, generational blessings, good health, and all these blessings to every area of lived activity for all time. This section is 1 through 14. But the second portion of Deuteronomy 28 represents the effects of disobedience and the reaping of utter chaos. This section is so thorough that it can invoke fear to its audience, but unfortunately, at the time, the audience that originally heard this message still disobeyed. The goal was to be so thorough and so terrifying that it would incentivize them to avoid this judgment. It was to show them everything they were getting themselves into with their choices, but they still wickedly turned away from God. The second portion of Deuteronomy 28 speaks about the attributes opposite to the blessings represented in 1 through 14. It talks about diseases, inborn and contagious, enemies ruling God's people, mass poverty, fatherlessness, the war between the sexes, the war between all of God's people, regardless of their different factions, being persecuted by outside groups, cannibalism due to poverty, abusing one's offspring, and the list of all areas of bad affecting lived activity taking place. And this is Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 68. That is all I have for this video. I hope it helps you with your awakening journey. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Gershly Karen Pierre, and stay tuned for more.